It's week 40, and this is the Confederation Report, the flagship weekly podcast of the Quintero Institute. My name is Stephen Martins, and I'll be your host, bringing you incisive analysis, cultural commentary, and thought-provoking interviews on the issues shaping Canadian life and beyond, all through the lens of a biblical worldview, because Christ is Lord, over Canada, over culture, over all of life. I'm joined today by Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson. For those unfamiliar with the name, he's the author of They Had Names, Tracing the History of the North American Indigenous People, as well as Replacing Darwin, The New Origin of Species, and Traced, Human DNA's Big Surprise. Nathaniel received his Bachelor of Science in Molecular Biology and Bioinformatics from the University of Wisconsin-Parkside, and his PhD in Cell and Developmental Biology from Harvard University. As an undergraduate, he researched the molecular control of photosynthesis, and his graduate work involved investigating the molecular and physiological control of adult blood stem cells. His findings have been presented at regional and national conferences and have been published in peer-reviewed journals since 2009. He has been actively researching the origin of species, both at the Institute for Creation Research and at Answers in Genesis. Nathaniel, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks so much for having me on, Stephen.
Nathaniel, I wanted to speak more specifically about your new book, They Had Names, particularly because you present a history many have never truly considered. Recently, I've been reading about various early figures from Canada's exploration years, John Cabot, Jacques Cartier, Samuel de Champlain, and in their stories, we encounter the Huron, the Iroquois, the Mi'kmaq, the Algonquins, the Mohawks, and so many others. And that's already a great deal to take in. It doesn't even begin to cover the other First Nations peoples across the Canadian landscape. Most, if not all, of these groups have their own traditions, but more often as myths than as documented historical fact. Your book, in many respects, restores what has been lost, and that's of immense value. So let me begin with the first question, just framing the big picture. Your book opens by juxtaposing Europe's visible ancient history with North America's seemingly blank pre-contact past. What first sparked your conviction that the story of Native America needed to be retold from the ground up?
That's a good question. I would say in terms of my interest in getting into this topic, there's a number of them. There's professional, there's apologetic, there's personal. On the personal side, so I was born and raised in Wisconsin, lower 48 states, and it was just a mystery to me. And I can say now, having traveled to Latin America, this is, I think, a hemisphere-wide mystery. For example, I was just in Brazil, and there was an Indigenista, Indigenous man, older now, near retirement, but had worked on some of the reserves and from an Indigenous tribe. And I said, so what did you learn about your tribal origins or migration? And he mentioned something about the tribe he came from. I think it says they came from Paraguay. That migration, I think, was actually post-contact, 1700s perhaps or so, fairly late in history. I said, well, what about before that? Nothing. Didn't learn anything. So I think it's much bigger than even a Canadian, a U.S. It just nobody learns about the pre-European history of the Americas anywhere, South, Central, North. And it's always been a puzzle. I had no ambitions to try to solve it. Just I grew up, so last history class was in high school, and we learned about European history details. I mean, a lot of people think European or any history is boring because it's names and places and dates and just a bunch of dry list of facts that you have to learn and regurgitate in a test. But it's still a lot more than anything we learned or were taught for pre-European North America, which was, again, nothing. I had no conception. I had no map in my mind. I like to tell a story of being in Fort Worth, Texas, because that's with the Institute for Creation Research. They were in Dallas-Fort Worth area. And the Fort Worth stockyards had a map up on the wall in the visitor center, or the gift shop. That was a map, I think, of contact North America, of all the tribes across the whole landscape, Canada, Alaska, lower 48 states, maybe even down to Mexico. And even that picture, which again, I think is still a snapshot in time, right when Europeans arrived, was instructive for me and almost an aha moment, because the map was full of peoples, each with their own small domains. And it reminded me of what I'd learned for probably Middle Ages Europe. It looked a lot like that. And the excitement was, even though even though the map didn't speak. It's not saying anything. It's not really telling a history. Just the fact that it resembled what I learned for Europe, or reminded me of what I learned for Europe, was exciting, because I'm like, I know the Middle Ages Europe map has a long history that precedes it and a long history that follows it. And so just to see that parallel, okay, there's something here. I couldn't tell you any more than that at that time. And this goes back 10 to 15 years ago. So it shows how much has changed for me personally in the interim. Again, it was not, I'm going to go solve it, because I would have had no idea where to start. I had started with the question of the origin of species about 15 years ago, humans being one of many species whose origin I was trying to explore, and moved more heavily into the human history question about 10 years ago, because there's just tons of human data. Again, the question of pre-European North America and solving that wasn't really on my to-do list, because what do I know about what we're going to find? It was more the question of, can we find echoes of biblical history in DNA? So my background is, at least for the past 15 years, has been working on genetics to understand these questions, the main biological tool then to understand these questions of origin of species and human history. And so I was working on the question of, does the family tree of humanity show Babel, or does it at least show the echoes of the history of civilization? That would be a tool to get us closer to that biblical event. I had started 10 years ago by trying to find Babel straight away, and then kind of reversed my approach, saying, well, let's maybe start in the present and work our way backwards through history, because then you kind of have confirmation as you go along the timeline to be confident that you've actually found Babel. Plus, that's an independent creationist prediction on its own, which is interesting in its own right. So we were finding successes, or at least I thought I found some initial successes. Was still struggling to figure out, well, where do we start the tree, and how is time stamped on this tree? So I say tree, but really there's a couple of steps to get there. We're comparing DNA from people around the globe. We're counting the differences, and then using that data to try to reconstruct something that looks like a family tree. And then from that, well, how does this work as a family tree? How does it record history? It's at that time that the Native American history became critical. So I'm sitting there thinking through, how do we solve this? What's going on? I had just read a book called 1491. Others may have read this. It's by a mainstream science writer, so not a creationist at all, not even sure he's a believer, just reporting on changes in mainstream science as it relates to pre-European Americas. Of course, that 1491 is a pregnant title. Right before Columbus arrives, what was it like? And one of the main questions he focuses on is the number of people here. And with this respect, he was showing, even in mainstream science, there's been a dramatic, well, I guess you could say, a revolution in this concept, where 50 years ago, there might be the dominant view of, there's a small gaggle of people spread throughout the Americas, hugging the trees, kumbaya, that sort of stereotype, and has shown that no, actually, from a lot of different lines of evidence, there were likely, conservatively, I guess, 50 to 60 million people in the Americas on the eve of Columbus's arrival. It's still hotly debated. And that in the years following, centuries following, the exact timing, depending on where you were in the Americas, 80 to 90% of the people disappearing. So I had that in my head. I'm like, we know this happened, massive population collapse after European arrival in the Americas to the indigenous people. There has to be a genetic smoking gun of this. And the process of finding it is really what started me down this path in an intense way. Again, even finding that was sort of a clue to the larger picture of, what does the whole tree look like globally? Can we find global human history? And so my book, Traced, in 2022, was on the global human history. And then I zeroed in more on North American pre-European history as a follow-up to that. And that just came out in May. But it was a product, ultimately, of going back to finding echoes of human history. And I should add, we did eventually find the echo of Babel in Genesis 10 in human DNA. And all that's given me confidence that what we're seeing here in DNA as it relates to pre-European history is valid in the Americas. And what's been exciting is to see how step by step we keep seeing additional confirmations of what we're pursuing. So I guess you could summarize it by saying it was, in a sense, a product of following the evidence where it leads, where it led. It led us down this path, and chasing things where the data got hot. So I guess you could say, I was interested in this for a long time, didn't know how to solve it, and as pieces started to come together, we kept chasing it, and it's been a I guess cycle after cycle of success in this research sense. I mean, you can want to solve it, and if you can't find any answers, it's pointless. So it's been a very fun arena to pursue, because there's actually been answers that have emerging, and a play-by-play, really. That's what the book is, a play-by-play of what happened in the pre-European Americas that's emerged, and that's been very satisfying as well.
Well, I think it's relatively safe to say you have drawn on your expertise in human genetics to reconstruct a global family tree. And you've touched a little bit already on this, but maybe you can just elaborate a little bit more as to how your genetic research intersects with the biblical accounts of the Tower of Babel and dispersal of mankind into the Americas.
Yes, and maybe I'll lay it out historically. So I'd begun about 15 years ago working on mitochondrial DNA. That's the DNA that's inherited through females. And let me back up and just give some context. If someone takes a DNA test from one of the major genetic testing companies like Family Tree DNA, 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, they'll likely test your autosomal DNA, which is just a fancy term for the DNA from both parents. Useful, helpful, especially, let's say, in cases about adoptees. I know this side, but not this side. Or maybe my dad was an adoptee, so I don't know what his side. It's wonderful in that respect. It's been delightful to help people try to figure out their ancestry that way, those who've contacted me. But it doesn't get you very far. The dirty little secret of that test is you pay $100 and you don't really learn much more than what you probably already know from your family tree. Again, exceptions for adoptees and such, but it's basically good for learning your grandparents' ethnicity. And the math is really kind of what shows this. So my DNA is 50% from mom, 50% from dad. The same biological reality holds true for them. So my mom is 50% genetically each of her parents, dad, same thing for his parents, which means then me would be, I would be 25% genetically each of my grandparents, excuse me, and then 12.5% great grandparents. The genetic percentage drops off precipitously in just a few generations. And to make a long story short, with regards to the technical side of things, anything below 5% is likely not reliable. So, great grandparents maybe, but there's weird things that can happen. I say weird, but there are biological things that happen from generation to generation where you can lose the genetic signal. I've had people talk to me like a native Hawaiian lady. I know my grandparent, let's say, was full-blooded or great-grandparent, and I'm not seeing anything in my genetic test. Well, it's plausible that it can be lost if the ancestors are genetically mixed or ethnically mixed. Anyway, so all that to say, autosomal DNA doesn't get you very far. You need some type of DNA where the other parent is not going to dilute it. So that's the double-edged sword of autosomal DNA from both parents. Yes, it's great because it's both sides of the family tree, but that's also the main drawback is mom's DNA basically dilutes the signal from dad's, and that happens every generation. If you have something like mitochondrial DNA just from mom, no input from dad, now we have the potential to go back deeper in history. And we had some initial successes. So people before me had been working on human mitochondrial DNA, female history, then maternal history. This is a DNA that kind of acts like a clock. So it changes every generation. We could say biblically, we live in a fallen world. And so whatever original mitochondrial DNA that Eve had, that Noah's wife had, that the wives of Noah's sons had, this has been changing over time because mistakes happen. And we can, for lots of different types of DNA, trace diseases to specific changes. So there's a bigger backstory here, but for our purposes, it acts like a clock. We can measure time, we can mark the passage of generations. Now, mitochondrial DNA is a little bit more like a sundial than like a stopwatch. So you can't be really precise. It's on average, and this varies, one mistake every 5 to 10 generations. So if you want to be really specific as to what year did this happen and when did these people migrate away, it gets messy. And there's statistical noise in the data as well. So for example, even though it's passed on through mothers, both men and women have it. So if you and I, Stephen, both have a mitochondrial test, we compare our differences. The test result might say, okay, AD 500, 1500 years ago, there was a common ancestor for the two of us, common maternal ancestor. The uncertainty would be probably plus or minus 1,000 years. So the average, the best guess might be 1,500 years ago, but it might be 2,500 years ago, or it might be 500 years ago. So was it the time of the ancient Greeks or the time of the Middle Ages? It's like, good grief, how is that helpful to figuring out what's going on? That's still orders of magnitude less than the difference between creation and evolution. I can still say, yes, this goes back roughly 6,000 years to Eve. We found evidence for that. We found what seemed like preliminary evidence for the flood. So that got us a good ways. And the interest I had about 10 years ago was based on, okay, let's look at the next major biblical event, Babel. Can we find it in mitochondrial DNA? and eventually abandoned that for a while just because of the statistical noise and trying to find the genetic echo of human history. You have to be precise if you want to figure out, when did the Huns enter Europe, or when did the Roman Empire fall, or who are the ancient Egyptians, and when were they invaded by the Assyrians or the Babylonians or whoever. You have to be able to get precise numbers. So I switched to another genetic compartment where, again, you're not getting dilution of the genetic signal from the other parent. In this case, it's the male inherited Y chromosome DNA. So this is only in males, passed from fathers to sons. Again, it acts like a clock, but you can be much more precise. So if you and I take a Y chromosome test, and the result is, 1,500 years ago, we had a common male ancestor, the precision would be plus or minus 200 years. So, or maybe 100 years on either side of that number, which is much more helpful. Now we can be much more precise and say, well, maybe this relates to the migration of the Huns, or maybe our ancestor is Roman, and as a result of the invasion of the Roman Empire, one of our ancestors went this way, another one migrated that way. It's that sort of thing you can begin to infer, and that's what gave us such great success in tracking down ultimately the echo of Babel. So that's male inherited DNA. If we think biblically about anthropology and genealogies in Scripture, those are of males. Genesis 10 in particular. These are the sons of Noah. Then it lists the sons of his sons and male descendants going down, about 70 names there. We can find the exact replica in male inherited DNA of that family tree. It's one of the biggest discoveries, I'd say, and this is not trying to pat myself on the back as much as this is a big deal for apologetics. We can find the echo of that tree. We can trace any tribe, any nation, any family back to specific sons of Noah, any one of those descendants in Genesis 10 by taking Y chromosome tests. It's been a thrilling ride. It took a while to get there, but this is one of the biggest outcomes of the research. We've now got a very strong confirmation of what the Scripture teaches about where all of us came from. Genesis 9, of course, saying explicitly, these are the three sons of Noah. I think it's verses 18 and 19, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. It says, and from these, the whole earth was repopulated. People ask me, what about other descendants of Noah? Could they have other kids? I said, in theory, maybe, but Genesis 9 says all of us go back to the three sons of Noah. My guess is no, they had no other children. But there we have the in DNA now, an echo, a confirmation of that fact.
Yeah, I want to take a step back here a little bit from the science and from the history here, and just talk just about the title of your book, the title's meaning, because that's significant in and of itself. This isn't just cold data that you're giving us. Why did you choose the title "They Had Names"? How does it capture both the humanity and the historical depth of for example, the First Nations of Canada and beyond?
There was a double meaning, I'd say, at least in that title. One comes from a historical, I guess, academic perspective, where, again, thinking to what I learned in school about European history, or I guess you could say history of Western civilization. I say that because in high school the class was titled World History, but have come to recognize it's basically history of Western civilization, Sumer and ancient Greece and Rome, and then Middle Ages and Reformation, Renaissance. I went to a Christian high school, so there was definitely a Christian angle and church history element and all that as well. There again, we had names of nations. We had names of kings associated with specific dates and battles, and all that humanizes that history. And whether you think it's boring or not, I think there's this, even if subconscious, there's an inherent respect that's gained from that, because you talk to someone on the street, what about the Romans? Yeah, I've heard about the Romans, or I've heard about ancient Egypt. It's common knowledge, and again, that I think that implies and builds respect for that culture, for that nation. And so if you have something like the Americas before Columbus, where there's nothing, and if you look at mainstream science, they are very reticent to connect modern tribal and First Nation names to specific archaeological sites. And I would say that, to give them the benefit of the doubt, that's largely an outcome of their technology, not necessarily bias. I'm an academic at heart, and so I also want to make sure we're rigorous in our conclusions. And I don't think the mainstream community has the tools. I can go into detail, but in short, I don't think they have the tools to be able to connect specific tribes to specific archaeological sites and retell the history. So just to jump ahead then, in the book, one of the backbones of the narrative is a Indigenous account from the Delaware, the Red Record of the Wallam Olam. There was a guy in 1995, I think, Ostreicher was his last name, who was doing his PhD in anthropology at Rutgers. Rutgers, I think, is the school. And argued that this document, which had been in existence since I think the early 1800s, was not in fact a Delaware history. It's a long the heart of the document is a long list of sachems or leaders, the chieftains, basically from the time of being in Alaska through a migration down the western coast of Canada, across the Great Plains of the United States, eventually, of course, ending up on the Atlantic coast near the state that now bears their name on the east coast of the U.S., Delaware. That history, he says, that was invented out of whole cloth by a Kentuckian by the name of Raffines. And he was so persuasive, he got the Delaware Nation, I think of Oklahoma, to reject it as authentic. And that's been the rule ever since, until I was doing this genetic research, Y chromosome specifically, and found out that the DNA of First Nations and Native Americans agreed with the data in the Red Record because there's an inherent time frame in that document. And all this together showed that it was actually valid. So I don't have answers for all of Ostreicher's claims as to why he thinks this is fake or invented a whole cloth. But from my perspective, I'm like, how can some Kentuckian in the early 1800s fake a history that just so happened to anticipate genetic discoveries 2 centuries in the future? That just doesn't happen. That's too implausible. It's basically impossible. The only way that sort of thing happens is if you have a real document that has real history and it's going to agree with history and DNA. So that's actually affected my attitude towards virtually any Indigenous document. I tend to default to they must be true unless shown otherwise, and I take them on a case-by-case basis. And there's been a number of Native American and First Nation contacts who've been very helpful in this respect. I think it was a Navajo lady in particular, a contact I have, who was pointing out, for example, for their history, she said, "Well, this particular ethnographer, he would hand out candy to kids, and of course, kids will tell you anything you want to hear. For candy, they're kids." But and then mentions, well, this guy over here, he was much more rigorous, much more careful. Maybe he talked to the elders. And anyway, she's like, you can trust this guy, but not this guy. So all that, we go about it rationally. It's not just reckless abandon. But still, this is a dramatically different attitude than what mainstream community has, where they, as basically a rule, reject all Indigenous accounts out of hand because they tend to be oral, or they just, again, I don't think they have the genetic tools to be able to confirm them. They have a much different time scale, and they just miss all this confirmation. So they had names because, number one, we now have the tools to connect archaeological sites to the names of tribes, First Nations at contact. That's a huge advance. And secondly, we can actually, again, it's through this Red Record document, they list the names of the sachems. We have specific people with names at major battles, major sites. We now have heroes we can recognize, winners and losers, in the pre-Columbian era, just like for European history. So I feel like this helps elevate it to the same level that we learned for European history, Western civilization. And as far as I'm concerned, that builds an inherent respect for this. My wish, dream, in a sense, is that all this is taught in school. So that every school child grows up, unlike I grew up, and I think every school child right now grows up learning virtually nothing about the pre-European Americas. And so the outcome I'd like to see, so this is great because it affirms scripture, it's from a scriptural time frame and perspective, it's all within the biblical worldview, and it's this biblical worldview that has affirmed the Indigenous accounts of migration and so on. And I think ultimately it helps build respect for the Indigenous people, their cultures, those who came before. It humanizes them because now we have, these are real people who did things and built things and had empires and lives and all that. So that's the background that they had names, because now we can put names on places both at the tribal level and at the personal individual level in ways that I've never seen before.
Now, you had earlier mentioned Charles Mann's book, 1491. In that book, he argues that pre-Columbian North America was densely populated. How does your work build on or diverge from his findings?
That's a good question. His findings were critical in tracking down and orienting how time. Well, I should clarify that's two different things. His work was critical in tracking down how time is stamped on the tree. So I took his discussion and documentation, or I guess you could say reporting of what other people have documented on the post-Columbian population collapse, and being able to find that in DNA was a huge step in figuring out DNA for the globe. And figuring out DNA for the globe, it's kind of one big spiral and cycle, helps give me confidence that what I'm finding in the Americas is true. Anyway, make a long story short, it's not just the population collapse, which I think once you see it, you can't unsee it in DNA. This is one of my strongest arguments. Anytime someone wants to disagree, I'm like, well, please explain why this finds the population collapse so well. And secondly, for some nations and tribes, there is a population, or there has been a population recovery. So I'm just going to use numbers from the Navajo because that's a data set I'm familiar with. They've posted numbers on their website, I think the Tribal Reserve website, where they talk about late 1800s, I think 10,000 people total in the nation. Well, the US Census in 2010, which had data broken down by Native American First Nation affiliation, even broke it down by, are you only Native American or Native American plus something else? And in both of those categories, is it one or more tribes or a single tribe? Anyway, just very detailed data. And there you have reporting that I think it's now 2010, about 400,000 Navajos. So that's a very significant population recovery. It's very late in history. I think it's too late for the evolutionary methods to detect, but the methods I'm using, grounded in the biblical framework, the biblical time scale, 4,500 years back to Noah, detects that as well. So that's one of my strongest, I think, it's one of our strongest apologetic arguments for the validity of what we're doing. The fact that this does record the biblical worldview, the biblical anthropology, because we're seeing well-known, well-documented post-Columbian events. And to kind of turn all this around, it was all that gave me confidence that when I'm looking backwards in time to the pre-Columbian era, what we're seeing with genetics is actually true. So that was a huge event. And in terms of being able to confirm numbers, I don't think we're quite there yet to know. I've tried to play with the genetic data to figure out, can we get down to specific figures as to how many people were here? One of the challenges in what I'm doing as it relates to man's specific numbers is I'm taking DNA from living people. So essentially the survivors of the population collapse. I don't know that we'll be able to use that to say exactly how many were there when you have 80 to 90% of who don't leave descendants because they died out. So I would say there's definitely unambiguous, very clear genetic echoes among the survivors that there was a population collapse, a massive one. But being able to put numbers on it, I just don't know that we'll ever have the tools. It'd be nice, but we're still at the early stages, and I'm anxious to see where it goes.
Just talking about nations, empires, and lost histories. In your book, you raise provocative questions about the Seminoles, the Lakota, and Crow. What surprised you most about the scale and interconnectedness of pre-contact nations across the Americas?
That's a good question. I'm thinking in terms of surprises. I think, on one hand, just one of the biggest surprises is simply being able to recover a history. People have asked me as well, is this rewriting history? I said, in one sense, yes, because it differs and diverges dramatically from the evolutionary narrative. But on another hand, I feel like the mainstream evolutionary narrative doesn't give us very much to rewrite. We don't learn about it. What was the greatest empire? Who were the biggest heroes and villains? What were the nations that fought the greatest battles? I don't think the evolutionists can tell you. They can tell you, well, there was this Mississippian culture, let's say in the southeast of the United States. There was the woodland time period. And those are names that make your eyes close because they're academic ones that seem to have no relevance to the peoples at contact. And again, that reflects the, I think, reticence of evolutionists to connect specific nations to archaeological sites. And again, I think it's just academic precaution combined with lacking the tools to be able to do so. I also have academic caution, but I've got a whole bunch of more tools at my disposal because of this young Earth time frame that's linking things up. And as each one keeps cross-confirming the other, it gives me confidence we're on the right track. And so all this has been a huge boon to it. And I got off on a tangent. You'll have to remind me again if the question is, because I got excited about it. So repeat the question so I can make sure I hit it.
What surprises were apparent to you when you looked at the interconnectedness of these groups in that context?
Yes. Okay. So there's the surprise of simply having a play-by-play that we're able to recover that I never even dreamed of. And that's just, to me, exciting in and of itself and almost a relief, like, that's what happened. Finally, mystery solved. Decades long, always bothered me. Never really knew what to do about it. No one had any answers. And curtains kind of pulled away and that's what it looks like. So there's relief at that. There's maybe in one sense, a surprise at the sheer dynamism,
Hmm.
because and I don't know if it's just sort of subconscious assimilation of the nature of the evolutionary narrative. So if we had if I go back 10 years, 15 years, what would I have said about the pre-European Americas? Just thinking biblically, it might be, well, I guess there was Babel 4,500 years ago, and we know that people split at Babel, and those are the ancestors of people groups around the globe. And so I guess someone came to the Americas. In other words, kind of taking the evolutionary narrative of 15,000 years ago, one migration, and I'm just kind of collapsing the timescale, but then nothing else to say. And the evolutionary narrative, of course, as a maybe a necessary consequence, talks and has built into it this idea of 10,000 years or more of isolation. Actually, it's technically 14,500 years of isolation until Columbus, essentially. The Americas, unlike any other place on the planet, basically, sit here in isolation. No one contacts them. They do their own thing. It's almost like an othering. There's the history of the Americas, the old world, and then there's those other people over there that don't fit the pattern. And so maybe it's a sense of there's a satisfaction, and no, that's almost dehumanizing. The Americas are like humans everywhere else on the planet. There was lots of migration, lots of movement. There's people coming from the old world into the new at multiple times in history. It's connected to old world civilizations, to events in the old world civilizations. It makes sense. It fits. And I don't know if that's a point of relief for me, because again, I don't know that I had a preconceived notion as much as, again, there may be this subconscious, well, I don't know what else to say. So I guess they kind of were just sitting here, right? And then there's this big event with Columbus. And then, in fact, oh, wait a minute, there's lots of events that were prior to that. And why not? They're humans just like the rest of us. They've descended from Adam and Eve, from Noah. And why wouldn't they do human things like we read about in history textbooks for the world over?
Trying to keep the ball rolling here. We're going to talk about the role of catastrophe. You note in your book that 80 to 90% of indigenous populations disappeared after European contact. And that's almost common sense, as we're all accustomed to learning about the early history and what essentially has happened when the Europeans came into the Americas, and a lot of the the viruses, the bacteria, the diseases, and the illnesses, and so forth. How does understanding that demographic collapse help explain the seeming absence of ancient ruins and records in North America today?
That's a good question. Let me just think aloud for a minute, and I think I may land with, I'm not sure it does. There's I think there's a connection of whatever was here gets abandoned. There's another angle of, I think we're still missing a lot of the history. So I feel like it's a regular part of the news cycle now, where we read about technology being applied to the Guatemalan jungle or the Brazilian Amazonian jungle, and there's lost cities emerging from the civilization. Well, in North America now, there's so much that has been settled. Maybe I'm thinking of the lower 48 states, because I remember looking at the population map of Canada, where, what's the statistic? 90% of the population is within 50 miles of the U.S.-Canada border or something. So there's still lots of unexplored or unsettled Canada, which I realized just as we're chatting. But still, there's if you look at, let's say, 1,800 maps. I'm thinking of the United States example now. So I'm in northern Kentucky. Indiana's right next door. Ohio's just north of me. There are now UNESCO sites of, let's say, Hopewell culture, mounds in Ohio. But you look at maps from 1800s and early explorers going and writing down, drawing, here's what we saw. And so much has been bulldozed now because of construction and the growth of the population and so on. That may be another angle of, yes, there's abandonment, probably, with population collapse. And then how much of the scale of that has been lost because the archaeological evidence has been bulldozed over or plowed under or whatever it is, just because population expands, goes westward, and so forth. But there's another angle to all this too, and I should add here a personal humorous story. My backyard in northern Kentucky here, I noticed I feel like everything in northern Kentucky is kind of built into some sort of hill. Either the back, you kind of open your back door and it goes down, or it's up into some sort of hill. So ours is up. I noticed it's kind of aligned with the path of the sun, and I've gone back and forth many times as to how big was the North American population. So basically north of the Rio Grande compared to Mesoamerica, let's say, Mexico and Guatemala and so on. And one of the phases where I'm like, there has to have been tons of people here, we're missing the evidence, got me thinking, well, maybe I should dig up my backyard. Maybe this is actually an Indian mound that no one's observed. Not that I recommend this to anyone. Probably leave the site alone, let the professionals handle it. But that's crossed my mind on many occasions. Where I'm at kind of right now, and again, it might change tomorrow, there's still so much that's unknown, is there seems to be a general hierarchy in the Americas. And what I'm basing this off of is the archaeological record that we know so far of Central versus, I'm just going to use Central versus North America. And let me just pull in a couple data points here. If you ask mainstream archaeology, where is the cradle of American civilization? They would not go to North America. They would say Central America, the Olmecs on the Gulf Coast of Mexico. And then they're followed by the Mayans, and then, of course, they're followed by Teotihuacan, and you got Toltecs, and there's a series of civilizations, and thankfully, some of these left records in stone we can go and examine. There doesn't seem to be stone pyramids that have been found in North America. You have Cahokia, which is, I think, the biggest earthwork mound in all of the Americas, in North America, if not all the Americas. I think it's 22 million cubic feet of fill or something near modern St. Louis. Have visited sort of I think it's the Illinois, Missouri border, about 5.5 hours drive for where I am. It's a really interesting site. But there seems to be this general absence of stone structures like you find in Latin America. And I think another reason the mainstream archaeologists point to Mesoamerica as the cradle is you just don't find significant archaeological evidence for a large population in North America. And I think in retrospect, I mean, hindsight's 2020, and it's easy to post hoc make some generalizations, but I think this fits. Mesoamerica has a much more conducive climate to agriculture. I don't know how many rounds of crops you can get per year, but agriculture, I feel like, is a necessary prerequisite to getting a large population growing. Whatever a population's desire is, you're constrained by how much you can feed the people. And the more you can feed them, the faster they can grow. And so it seems like Central America was always the epicenter where there's the most activity historically in the pre-European Americas. And I think that's likely a consequence of the climate, where you can just grow more, feed more, and so the population grows faster. Whereas North America, there's a limit, of course, to crop growing. I mean, with modern technology, we can push it somewhat. But I mean, I grew up in Wisconsin, so thick snow. The planting and growing season is obviously significantly different than Guatemala or Mexico, and that's going to constrain how much people can grow. And in a sense, I would say civilization kind of correlates with population size and geographic constraints. So I think another aspect of the Central American epicenter, the nature of that, is they're also constrained. So let's say the population grows and some guy gets it in his head that I'm going to rule all these people. What are you going to do? You can try to resist him. You can kind of flee, but there aren't that many places to flee to because you're surrounded by water. You're kind of this isthmus or peninsula. Whereas in North America, it's so vast. If this guy is bothering you, you just leave and he can't go chasing you, which I think that's helpful for survival, but then it's going to slow down your rate of organized labor, civilizational growth. And so that's a long way of saying it seems that the hierarchy of, I guess, civilizational advance seems to be Central America as the priority. Then North America is kind of secondary to that. And then just thinking of wider North America, Southwest United States, Arizona, New Mexico area, they got the cliff dwellers, spectacular ruins. They get a lot of press. But in terms of the hierarchy, they seem to be almost last. So in North America, just to give an example, of course, you got Olmecs building civilizations, sculpting giant heads in 1600 BC or some early era. I don't think you actually have villages archaeologically in the United States until the first millennium AD. It surprised me how late it was. And then eventually get cities like Cahokia, 10 to 15,000 people, I think in like the 1200s, which is comparable to the size of London. So it was significant. But there seems to be this relative ordering, which I think, again, is a consequence of climate. And so how many people in North America? I'm kind of back to the maybe not quite as many as I thought, just because the climate isn't as conducive. There's a lot of snow here, as it might be in Central America. And that's been a factor, one of the major factors in how the history has played out.
Now, I want to, at this point, integrate some of the oral traditions in archaeology. How have oral histories, linguistic evidence, and archaeological data helped you reconstruct the missing millennia of North American history in your research?
Yes, and I'm gonna clarify or confess. The book, of course, covers the play-by-play primarily for AD 900 and onward, which means there's thousands of years prior, of course, where I don't give that much detail because we don't have it yet. And of course, you might ask, well, why write a book? And I address that in chapter 1, saying, well, I think what we have is revolutionary and worth saying. So here's where we're at right now, in hopes that other people will come along. And I mean, the research I'm doing is ongoing, but other people after me will come along and build on this. And Native Americans will be able to build on this, integrate their own oral histories. Sort of the dominoes that fell in recovering this history were, number one, finding genetic evidence of a dynamic history in the pre-Columbian Americas. That was step one. Step two was finding, oh, wait a minute, the genetics agrees with these oral histories. There's confirmation. Within these oral histories, and this is actually one of the most important tools because there's a lot of detail there, for example, in the Red Record of the Delaware, the Wallam Olam, that you won't find with genetics. Genetics can't tell you the names of the leaders. It'll tell you, okay, there are these two people, they live over here right now, but they had a common ancestor back here, and so they must have been in one spot, and it's useful. It's just not as detailed as what an oral history or an indigenous history might be able to tell you. And then it's the indigenous histories where, in combination with genetics, we can put timestamps. So the Red Record itself, if you just take it at face value, talks about a migration into the Americas, and maybe that it's a pretty wide range, like the 200s, I think, to 900s AD. That's not very precise. It's a lot of wiggle room then for trying to date events that follow that arrival in the Americas. With genetics, we're able to say, narrow it down to it's the 900s when they arrived, and then put specific timestamps because there's this list of sachems. So and so was a sachem. Here's what happened. So and so was a sachem. Here's what happened. That chieftain, and being able to put dates on that with genetics is what then, as it's step three or third domino that fell, was okay. Here the Red Record describes, for example, that the Delaware and their ancestors came to the Mississippi. They encountered someone who ruled the East. Who's that? Well, there's a Mississippian culture that describes a culture that, in essence, covers the eastern part of the United States, or southeastern part. Then you have the Natchez. Their own indigenous history talks about coming from Mexico and then eventually ruling what sounds like the East. So here's a couple different pieces that are coming together. With the Red Record and genetics, I'm able to date this encounter to about the mid 1200s AD. There's a initial slaughter, then a regroup, and a refighting of the battle, and eventual defeat of the Natchez or whoever ruled the East, and they progress. Well, archaeology shows that Cahokia, which was the epicenter of the Mississippian culture, St. Louis, Illinois, Missouri border, that reached its peak in the 1200s and then was abandoned, apparently, in the 1300s. Oh, aha. Okay, really interesting correlation here. That's how the narrative has emerged. And there's other examples of indigenous histories kind of cross-correlating with each other. There's linguistics, which you can make inferences about. Okay, these people were here and here at contact, but they have a linguistic hierarchy, and so the order of their appearance must have been this. And so you can make geographic inferences. That's what we did heavily for the Lakota and Dakota and other Sioux and Catawban language family members. So it's these four fields, genetics, indigenous history, archaeology, and linguistics, that together with, again, the biblical framework, have allowed that history to emerge, and it's been very satisfying to see things line up very nicely. It wasn't an all-at-once thing. It was kind of a slow plodding step by step, but as each piece and detail emerged, it was exciting and reassuring that, okay, I think we're on the right path.
I just want to talk a little bit more about the implications for Canadian First Nations. Much of your book resonates with members of Canada's First Nations, as the Cayuga reviewer noted. What unique insights emerge when focusing specifically on the peoples north of the U.S. border?
The first thing that comes to mind is the Canadian First Nations were instrumental in making this first connection between genetics and Indigenous history. So the Delaware people, to whom belong the Wallam Olam of the Red Record, are part of the Algic or Algonquin language family. We have census data for the United States and Canada in terms, again, of Native Americans, First Nations, and it turns out that about 70%, this is, I think, the 2016 Canadian census, about 70% of Canadian First Nations members are all part of the same language family, the same one as the Delaware, the Algic or Algonquin. Fine. What does that matter? There's your census data. And I should add, in the United States, the numbers are about reversed. So in Canada, Algic or Algonquian language family members are the overwhelming majority of living First Nations members. In the United States, I guess the percentages are much more distributed, or there's in a sense a greater diversity. So the Cherokee and Navajo, that would be the Iroquoian language family, and the Athabascan language family, or Ayak Athabascan language family, dominate the numbers. But even then, they're about 20 to 25%, not 70%. And the Algic language family members, which would include Shawnee, Delaware, others, I think are about 15%. So more than 70% of United States Native Americans are not Algic or Algonquian, whereas the reverse is true in Canada, about 70%. Now let's go to genetics. Family Tree DNA is one of the major genetic testing companies. They have a publicly available data set of Y chromosomes, so male inherited DNA test results. They do not have their data reported by individual Native American tribe or First Nation. It just says, hey, this is a Native American branch and it's the United States. This is a Native American branch or a First Nation branch, Canada. So that's why the census data were useful. And it turns out that the overwhelming majority of Canadian genetic testing results for First Nations, at least the Native American branches, were in one particular branch. And anyway, make a long story short, the genetic results correlated with the census results. There was one particular branch that was very heavy in Canadian First Nations as per the genetic testing results. And looking at the census data where the overwhelming majority are Algic, I'm like, aha, there it is. We found the Algic language family branch. And so it was Canadian data that were so helpful in laying down the initial planks of this study and figuring out who belongs to who. That study then, so the Red Record, I should say, in combination with linguistics, unraveled even more. And so I should say the book has a very heavy focus on the Algic language family history, which means then it has a lot of implications for a lot of Canadian First Nation individuals, because again, the vast majority I know by census belong to the Algic language family. And I should clarify here, I've been saying it's the Delaware Red Record. It turns out if you run the numbers and do a deep study of it, it's a record of the entire family. So just to give some clues to this, in the Red Record, there's about 6 times it mentions so-and-so moves away, or the population grew and then the turtle band left and went east, or we were on the Great Plains and there was drought and so there was contention naturally, and so this people group broke away in anger. We can place those, I guess, separations based on clues in the Red Record at specific geographical points in the tribes or nations' migration. We can put timestamps on it. And what's interesting is, if you look at the linguistics and the linguistic hierarchy of the Algic language family, there's about 6 or 7 temporal divisions. It's recognized that the way the languages are classified, the way they compare and differ from one another, there's kind of this west to east pattern. And it fits the hierarchy and in terms of numbers and such, it just fits the pattern that we see in the Red Record. If you then add on top of that what some of the individual Algic language family members say about their origins, Shawnee, Blackfeet, others, it all lines up. So we can tell for, I'd say, the vast majority of the Canadian First Nations peoples, their history, because the key tool in this book is an Algic language family members history, and it turns out that this history is actually the history for the entire language family, a whole bunch of nations. So there's huge ramifications of this research for the history of Canadian First Nations peoples. The book goes into more than that, but this is really the backbone and where we have the most detail.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nathaniel. I got 2 more questions here just to kind of wrap everything up and put all the threads together. The first is talking about a living conversation. It's not a finished story. You emphasize that your conclusions are provisional. You invite further research. Personally, what areas of inquiry or evidence would you like to see explored next by others?
One of the main things that had bothered me, so the book came out in May, and what has bothered me for a while is, and I show this in the book, in terms of Y chromosomes, the oldest branch that we have in the Americas. So again, if you just say, let's test all the Native Americans that we can, First Nations, for their Y chromosomes, what branches do they belong to, and how far back can we trace them? Well, you go back to about the 300s to 600s AD. So let's just pick 300 AD as the oldest point. That's when these Native American branches, First Nation branches connect to not to Canada, sorry, Canadian branches connect to Asia. Native American branches connect to Asia. That oldest branch is the 300s AD. So and just to clarify from before, the Algic language family migration happens from Asia about 900 AD. So there are multiple migrations from Asia into the old from the old world into the new, from Asia into the Americas. The oldest branch I can find, though, the oldest migration is about the 300s AD. And I show in the book there's plenty of archaeology that long predates that. So it implies some sort of population replacement, and of course raises the question of who did the early Americans come from, and why don't we find their branches? And I feel like that was probably one of the strongest counter arguments to what I was doing. I kept chasing this line. I published the book because we've got a lot of other evidence, global evidence that says this is in fact valid, but it kind of sits in your craw. Why can't I find it? And if you look at the history of my publications, one of the first technical papers I published, 2020, you look at Trace, 2022, even they had names, 2025. I've kind of dealt with that problem in different ways. In 2020, I didn't really deal with it as much just because it was so fresh and new. In 2022, I'm like, well, there's lots of peoples around the globe where we don't have all the ancient branches. And the math of what I'm doing predicts that a deeper search, and I'm talking orders of magnitude, more testing, might reveal this, because ultimately, for reasons that are technical and would take long to explain, the family tree reflects changes in population size. And just the way the math has worked out in human history, we're seeing primarily recent history, and it takes a lot more sampling to go back deep in history. So maybe just with time it'll be discovered. One of the peoples in particular, this goes down into Central America, but that represents one of the strongest counter arguments to my claim would be the Mayans, because they have written in stone records that go back, kings lists to the 250 AD. There's the pre-classic Maya that I think you even have inscriptions back to the BC era. They're in Guatemala and flourishing, just kind of boom, exploding, or almost appearing out of nowhere, it seems. There's a recognized start to Mayan archaeology, 1000 BC in the lowlands of Guatemala. And so, and I should add, yes, the civilization has collapsed, but the Mayan languages are spoken to this day. There's, I think, 10 million people in Guatemala. There's Guatemalans in the United States. I play soccer with them on Sunday nights. They speak Mayan languages. If there should be a Y chromosome that goes back deeper than 300 AD, and given the languages that are spoken today, why doesn't it exist? That's been something that's bothered me. Well, long story short, made a discovery that just came out in July, where I found deeper lineages, and it was going back to the female inherited DNA, the mitochondrial DNA that I'd put aside because of statistical problems. Well, to make a long story short, the reason I was able to solve it is we have Y chromosome data for the Americas. So just to give you the sequence of steps of making this discovery, this whole arena of exploration started with census data, or I should say post-Columbian data. We know there's a post-Columbian population collapse. We know there's a post-Columbian population recovery. Start there. Start with what you know and work backwards. So I used that, found the echo of the post-Columbian history in Y chromosome DNA, and then I was able to work backwards in time, but then kind of got stuck at the 300s AD. Then I take the mitochondrial DNA. So let's do the same thing, but now we've got additional data. I've got the post-Columbian population collapse, post-Columbian population recovery, which it turns out mitochondrial actually records with exquisite detail, maybe even better than Y chromosome, the data that we have, those facts. And then I can say, well, here's how the Y chromosome looks for 300 AD to contact. Does the mitochondrial DNA look like this? Yes, we can find the same confirmation there. And then mitochondrial DNA goes deeper. So the mitochondrial DNA adds 2 more migrations. Just to summarize then, from back to front, what happened in the Americas so far, what we know now, there must have been a migration from Babel into the Americas, probably gave rise to the Olmecs, maybe more than one, who knows? I just don't have any genetic data that early. Then there's a migration 1000 BC, gives rise to the Mayans. 100 BC, which I think, again, down in Central America, is the city of Teotihuacan, greatest city in all pre-Columbian America, is a whole other story there. And then 300s AD, and then 900s AD, there's at least 5 migrations into the Americas. I can say happily that after the book came out, we were able to solve one of the biggest remaining mysteries. But in terms of what's still left, again, that's a wonderful advance to know, okay, here's some clues now to what happened in the earliest eras. But in terms of a play-by-play, we're a long way from that. So one of the things I'm still anxious to continue to gather, to talk to First Nations members about, to Native American nations, what do you say about your history? Because there's so much before AD 900 that we've not been able to work out. I can talk about the 8900s and later because of this red record, the Wallam Olam, and can line it up with other migration accounts. Let me just use another example. The Sioux and Catawbans, you look at the various nations within that language family, like the Lakota, Assiniboine, Dakota, and so on. And I can, based on their own histories of migration, trace them back to about AD 800 in the area of what's now Washington, D.C. in the lower 48 states. They say they came from the north, perhaps from Canada, and then the record seems to go dark. They do have some sort of astronomical correlation to the Black Hills of South Dakota that might put them in the BC era. But what happened between the BC era and, AD 800, I don't know that they have an account, or I haven't found the data yet. So there's still a millennia of history, of detail to be filled in, so much more to be done, and I'm anxious to find out what the answers are.
Oh, that's wonderful, Nathaniel. Here's the last question now, just to kind of drive it home. Rethinking history from Genesis onward for Christian readers, especially. How does the book They Had Names deepen our understanding of the biblical narrative from Babel to the Great Commission? And most particularly, how might it reshape the way churches approach First Nations history and outreach?
There's a lot wrapped up in that, and let me think of a few answers just off the top of my head in different categories. So I'd say, just think about it from a biblical perspective, maybe then think about apologetic perspective, and then maybe a social perspective. So biblically, and then this is, I give a talk here at the Creation Museum Ark Encounter about how do Native Americans connect to Noah. And I'll say, how do we answer this question? We should start with the Bible, right? Yes, great place to start. So you have creation, Genesis 1 and 2, you have the fall, Genesis 3, you have the flood, Genesis 6 through 9, Babel, Genesis 10, 11. And then what? Everyone goes back to Babel, but what can you learn about Native American history from Scripture? Because from Genesis 11:10 onward, verse 10, Genesis 11 ends basically with a line of Abraham, and from that point forward, Old Testament focuses almost exclusively on Abraham and his descendants and their neighbors. Yes, there's prophecy that shows up there as well, but New Testament, of course, is focusing on Jesus and his ministry and the apostles. There's still a very Mediterranean, Levant, Middle Eastern focus to the Old and New Testaments after Genesis 11. You're not going to find a lot in the Bible about what happened in the Americas. And what's exciting about this research is we're using and have as the grounding and as the critical component of this research the biblical time frame and chronology and anthropology. And with that, we've been able to go to genetics, to archaeology, to linguistics, to indigenous histories, and fill in the details, kind of fill in the gap between Babel and now in ways that exceed the abilities of the evolutionists to do so. So that kind of gets me into the second category of apologetically. And let me give a little backstory here too. If you look at the history of the creation evolution movement, the heyday, I would say, was really back in the 1970s. I was born in 1980. I talk about that as the heyday from reading. I didn't experience it personally, but it sounds like it was a really exciting time with debates on college campuses all across the nation, thousands of students coming out, unbelievers coming out, evolutionists being surprised. They came out and admit saying we weren't prepared to debate science with the creationists, caught them on the wrong foot. Creation science was being introduced into public schools. And then it kind of all got shut down by about the 1980s. Court decisions in the United States with regards to the public school question. And then the evolutionists basically said, we're not going to debate anymore. We're not gaining anything by this, so we're just going to stop. Creation movement has continued and done so successfully. Excuse me, I feel like we've reached the church. There's been a lot of good things that have happened, but the evolutionists, our enemies, have been clever to shut down, excuse me, and marginalize the public debate. And I would say the 1970s era and a lot of what we've done even in the decades since is what I would categorize as lawyer work. The evolutionists, naturally, because they're the majority, they get billions of dollars of US government funding for research, get to present their case unimpeded in the classroom. And then because of court decisions and other restrictions that have been placed upon us, outside the classroom, we come along and cross-examine it like a lawyer would. And I would say very effectively. Even you look at Henry Morris and Dwayne Gish's debate strategies in the 1980s, it was basically an anti-evolutionary argument instead of 4 points or so they made against evolution. Devastating critique of evolution. And even the creation material I grew up on, it just there's so many holes in the concept. And this is no disrespect to evolutionists. I'm like, it kind of makes me laugh. It just is such a persuasive, good case. And that may have been part of the reason the courts tried to shut it down, because it was too good. Can't let that happen. Nonetheless, what the courts demanded then, because this is a relevant question, if lawyer work, according to the courts, is not good enough to be taught in the science classroom, if we're not allowed to even poke holes in evolution, what, pray tell, must creationists do to be considered, be allowed to be part of the scientific discussion, be allowed a place at the scientific table, be allowed a place in the public schools? And the technical form of the court's answer is they say we must make testable predictions. Sort of a good analogy for this is they've said not lawyer work, but detective work. Go find a question, go generate your own data, go solve a case, and then come back and report to us. That's what this work represents. It's kind of second gear, or the next phase of creation science. I would say it's a new way to win the debate. We continue to do the lawyer work because it's good, it's persuasive, it's excellent, and we're also doing now this detective work, which erodes the legal case against creation completely. There's no excuse now for the courts to say you can't teach this. If people want to relitigate this, they could. I would say the dawn of a new era in the creation science movement. And this is, again, not patting me on the back as much as the hero of this story is the young Earth timescale. I come along and it's kind of like shooting fish in a barrel. You find the answers quickly because the Bible's true, and it's not just permissible to use the Bible in the science classroom. It's actually a critical tool to find scientific answers, a necessary prerequisite. That's what the research shows objectively, because it's making these connections. So there's huge apologetic ramifications to what's going on. It may not seem like this at first pass. Well, you're not even mentioning Darwin in the title. What does this have to do with it? Well, it has tremendous to do with it, because this is this new phase of showing that we can even do it better, or we're doing detective work. It is bona fide detective work that has been successful. And just to add, and this maybe gets us into the social consequences, just to add maybe the surprising ramifications of this, I feel like the evolutionists, in a sense, took a gamble when they put these court decisions in place, fought so hard to kick creation science out, and put all their eggs in the basket of testable predictions or telling creationists, go do detective work. Why is that a risk? I mean, they hedged their bets. That we don't get billions of dollars of government funding, so they tried to make sure that we wouldn't be able to succeed as detectives. But we have, and I would say this pre-European history of the Americas is, for the evolutionists, a cold case. We don't learn about it in school because they don't have good answers. They can't tell you what's the empire, which nations built this site. Well, we don't know. There's just a lot of blank. There's nothing you learn. And so when we've talked about this on YouTube, for example, some of these videos go viral. I invite people to contact me. Some of them who do say, I don't like that Bible stuff, but I think you're onto something. So it's reaching into audiences I don't think have had access to before. And I think the reason is the nature of the risk. When you actually do detective work, you make discoveries. Discoveries make news. They meet needs that other positions like evolution have not been able to meet, and that gets people's attention. And I don't know how you stop that, because there's a natural curiosity. And if this other position comes along and meets that need, I mean, you can make it illegal, stop talking about it, but people still want to know, and they're going to find a way to find the answer. So that's an exciting part. And to get into the social side, that's part of the social angle, maybe an evangelistic angle then too. But I've seen a very surprising positive response from the Native American community. So this, I think, is your question about how do churches relate. One of the premier examples of this is I was invited December 2023 by the Lakota Nation. So I should say they have the Lakota Treaty Council Conference that happens every year. They're still very traditional, I would say pretty anti-Christian, anti-colonial for sure, maybe even somewhat anti-Caucasian. I was one of the few Caucasians at the meeting. They are, again, by invitation and invited to speak on DNA and Indigenous histories. Doors being opened that wouldn't be opened otherwise, I think. And to the point of, what am I doing here? It seems so out of place. I'm an open creationist, a Christian, and I think the answer is because evolution offers them nothing better. They're trying to figure out their histories. They don't like evolution in the sense the worldview, again, a very indigenous worldview of the Lakota, has a creator concept. They're creationists in that sense, but also, of course, as a matter of religious doctrine, believe we originated here on this continent. So there's this disagreements, obviously, still with what I'm proposing. But nonetheless, the fact that I'm coming along and saying, hey, I think genetics within this framework is going to confirm your very detailed migration narrative, that's appealing. And I think it's appealing because no one else is offering this. Evolution is not. I think evolution has kind of done the opposite of attempts to reject out of hand the migration accounts. And so this is perhaps thawing some resistance that there's been between church communities and Native American communities, First Nation communities, which I think is very exciting. I think it's a long process of getting to know one another, and of course lots of history of hostility and such, and misdeeds and sins and all that. So it takes a while to work through that. But this seems to be building a bridge that didn't exist before, and I'm very anxious to see where it goes.
Thank you so much, Nathaniel, for your time. I know how busy you are, but just a great privilege to be able to have you here on the show for us.
Thanks so much, Stephen.
Thanks for listening to the Confederation Report. This podcast is brought to you by the Quintero Institute. Visit our website at quinteroinstitute.org for more information. For books to read on worldview, philosophy, and theology, visit our store at quinteroinstitute.store. We'll see you again next week.